Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Camila Cruz and I'm a first year studying social studies and philosophy at the college. Now, before we begin, I'm also a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee. And now before we begin, please take a moment to note the exit doors located on the Park side and JFK Street side of the building. In the case of an emergency, please walk towards the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Now, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Please join me in welcoming IOP Resident Fellow of Spring 23, Sherry Bustos. Congresswoman Sherry Bustos.
All righty, let's hear it for Camila. You are in for a really, really great night tonight for the next hour. It is my honor to welcome in just a moment Congressman Adam Schiff. He and I were colleagues together. He was first elected in 2001. Were you alive in 2001? Okay. He was first elected to Congress in 2001, so he's been there for a little while. He and I served together for 10 years. I was in Congress for 10 years. And he is what I would call a member's member. What does that mean? Always prepared. Did anybody watch the January 6th committee? Always prepared. Never a show-off. Did anybody watch the impeachment trial? Always prepared, always ready. Never a show-off. And on top of it, a good part of Adam Schiff's job as a member of Congress was behind closed doors that you never even got to see, and that was because he chaired the Intelligence Committee. And so I'm very proud that Adam was willing to come here. He is in the middle also of not only serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, but also running for Senate in the nation's largest state. So he is a very busy man. So the fact that he took time to be here at the Institute of Politics at Harvard is really, I think, we're blessed that he is here with us tonight. And on top of that, we're going to have a guy sitting next to him who's going to moderate a really interesting discussion. Paul Kolbe is a senior fellow and the former director of the Intelligence Project at the Belfer Center, and he will direct tonight's conversation. Adam and Paul will talk for about 20 minutes, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. So think of the questions that you will have. With that, let's welcome Paul and Congressman Adam Schiff to the stage.
Well, good evening, everyone. Great to see a great turnout here on a beautiful spring day in Cambridge. I might have been doing something else when I was an undergrad, but good to see everyone here. Congressman, it's so great to have you here. We've got an hour to fix the world, so we'll get right into it. You're chairman of HPSI, House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. I'd like for you just to give a quick overview for the audience, those that might not be familiar with the oversight process, what it means for the intelligence community, and how it fits with the executive, of what oversight is.
Yeah. Well, first of all, how wonderful to be here. I'm originally from Framingham, so I feel like I'm coming back home. Also went to law school here, and it's wonderful to be back. I am still, I'll have you know, for those of you who are natives of the state, that I have remained a Red Sox fan through thick and thin. In fact, I used to tell a joke about the Red Sox fan who dies and goes to heaven, and in heaven you get to ask God one question. This was before the Red Sox started winning, by the way. And the Red Sox fan says to God, "God, when are the Red Sox going to win the World Series?" And God shrugs and says, "Not in my lifetime." But wonderful to be with you all. I want to acknowledge my wife Eve is here with me as well. We're Adam and Eve. I had the great pleasure of serving as the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee and then the chairman for many years up until Mr. McCarthy promised some of the more radical elements of the Republican conference that if he were elected Speaker, he would remove me from the committee, which he did. But the committee is kind of a unique oversight challenge, because unlike the other committees which operate for the most part in open session, in which if there's a witness who is testifying and making representations that stakeholders know not to be the case, they can very publicly call them out on it. But our hearings are classified. They take place in a skiff, what we affectionately call the bunker, 3 floors below the Capitol. And there is no outside body if the representative of this intelligence agency or that should say something that needs to be challenged. And as a result, we are really dependent on a couple things, more so I think than other committees. We are dependent on having staff that know the right questions to ask, because after all, the oversight we're doing of these agencies, we're overseeing agencies that make a living out of keeping secrets. And so unless you know specifically what to ask, you may not get the information you need to bring about a reform, or make sure that agencies are talking to each other, or make sure that if agencies aren't allowed to talk to each other about certain things, that they're not talking to each other. And the other thing that we are really dependent on, in addition to staff that's very knowledgeable, often that comes out of the agencies, is we're dependent on whistleblowers. People who are willing to blow the whistle through the established process of the Inspector General, of the intelligence community, or of a particular agency, which is part of the reason why we are normally so protective of whistleblowers. And I say normally because during the Trump years we had a terrible aberration in which one party decided that no, whistleblowers who blew the whistle on the last administration were somehow, as the former president said, traitors and spies, instead of what they were, which was doing their patriotic duty and informing the committee if they were observing wrongdoing. I now serve on the Judiciary Committee, and oversight there is a very different animal, I must say, not the least of which because the committee is currently chaired by Jim Jordan, but also because one of the other attributes of the Intelligence Committee and meeting in closed session is that there's almost never a case where within the committee hearings you have members grandstanding, because there's no one to grandstand to. If someone on the committee were to be all full of themselves and go through some dramatic showing, we would look at them and say, Paul, who are you talking to? It's just us. It's just us. The Judiciary Committee, where I now serve, like so many other committees in Congress, has become very performative. And the members often not even interested in what the witnesses have to say, talking over each other. And so the oversight is of a very different character, and in some respects really can't be called oversight because that's not the primary purpose. But the intel work is really quite unique in its way.
So with, you often talk about intelligence failure. Is there such a thing as intelligence oversight failure?
Oh, absolutely. And I think if you look at the run-up to the war in Iraq, when the administration was making representations about what the intelligence was showing, the failure to do better oversight of the sources of that intelligence to more aggressively challenge the conclusions of some of the agencies, or even whether the agency conclusions were being misrepresented by the administration, would be an oversight failure. And I would say also, and these aren't matters that we can discuss here, but a big part of the responsibility of the committee is overseeing the expenditures of the committee, the investment in new technologies, in, for example, our overhead architecture, satellites. And those can be very expensive systems. They're not always successful. And if you have a substantial and costly failure, sometimes it's the result of a subcontractor's work, sometimes it's the result of other things, but it also can be the result of an inadequate level of oversight. Congress not knowing the level of technical risk and not being a better steward of taxpayer dollars. So yes, there can be a variety of different kind of oversight failures. Can I just say too about your fellow Sherry Bustos, I just want to acknowledge her tremendous service in the Congress. Sherry managed to do something that has become exceedingly rare these days, which is in an increasingly bitter and partisan environment to develop a reputation and respect by members on both sides of the aisle for her ability to get things done, to deliver for her constituents, and great pleasure to see you again and join the show.
So you touched on partisanship there a little bit. Within the intelligence committees and CISI and in the House, have you seen a change in the level of partisanship in the committees? How it impacts and how does that impact oversight?
Yeah, the Senate Intelligence Committee has generally had a reputation for greater civility, comity, and bipartisanship, particularly in, I would say, the last 6 or 8 years, for the predominant reason that it fell to the House Judiciary Committee to do the investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 election, and then very soon thereafter to do the investigation of Donald Trump's withholding of military aid in order to extort the president of Ukraine into announcing an investigation of his opponent. Because those two very high-profile investigations landed in the House Intelligence Committee, that became a very partisan environment. The kind of untold story, though, of even those years when Devin Nunes and I were at bitter loggerheads with each other, is that notwithstanding the very open and acrimonious disputes we had over the former president's conduct, nevertheless, and without really even discussing it, we both made the decision, I think, quite independently, that we were not going to let the work of the committee go undone. That is, every year, and this is something that's also somewhat unique about the Intelligence Committee, the product of a whole year's worth of oversight is rolled into a single bill, the Intelligence Authorization Act. So all the funding levels for the agencies, all the new investments in technology, all the new civil liberties and privacy protections, all of that and more is rolled into a single bill. If you get the bill passed, you've done your work. If you don't, then the whole year was wasted. And every year, notwithstanding the very open and bitter fighting between the two of us, we got that work done. And that bill passed in the House Intelligence Committee, often when the Senate couldn't get it passed. And so while we were publicly much more at loggerheads, privately we still got our work done. And I would say that with Nunes' departure from the committee, with the end of those investigations, we saw a return of civility and comity on the committee. And that has continued now with the new leadership, and I think that's very positive for the committee.
Talked about Russian interference. Some refer to it as collusion hoax. There's a narrative out there that it was all made up. This is all a dirty tricks campaign. There was no Russian malfeasance. How do you get back to making clear what Russia did in terms of trying to put a thumb on the scales of the electoral process and of trying to penetrate campaigns, both Democratic and Republican?
Well, there are two, I think, issues involved with that. One is, what did the Russians do to try to determine the outcome of the 2016 election? And the other is, to what degree was there collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians to help further both the Russian object of having Trump win and Trump's own object of winning? And in terms of the Russian interference in our election, they interfered in predominantly two ways. They interfered by hacking into the Democratic Party emails, and then dribbling them out through cutouts, dribbling them out through WikiLeaks, through DC leaks, and other cutouts in order to influence the 2016 campaign. They also embarked on a clandestine social media campaign out of St. Petersburg, where they were pushing social media in a way that would both divide the American public, but also suppress votes for Hillary Clinton and assist the Trump campaign. So this is what the Russians were doing writ large to try to influence and elect their preferred candidate, Donald Trump. Now, in terms of the collusion, there were a few things that really, I think, stood out. One was that early in the summer of 2016, after the Russians had hacked the Democratic Party emails, and actually even before the summer of 2016, they reached out to a Trump foreign policy advisor named George Papadopoulos through an intermediary and said that essentially they could aid the Trump campaign by publishing these stolen emails through cutouts. So the Russians previewed to the Trump campaign exactly what they would end up doing. Now, some months later, the Russians again, through an intermediary, reached out to Donald Trump's son, Don Jr., and offered dirt on Hillary Clinton as what the intermediary described as part of the Russian government's effort to assist the Trump campaign. And the president's son, rather than reject it, rather than call the FBI, wrote back and said that if it's what you say it is, we would love it, and suggested that the best timing would be in the summer. And sure enough, in the summer, the Russians began to dump these emails. But more than that, the president's son set up a secret meeting in the Trump headquarters to get the dirt that was promised on Hillary Clinton. Then lied about the meeting, said it never happened, and then lied about what took place during the meeting. And then finally, a couple other data points. Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was secretly meeting with an agent of Russian intelligence during the 2016 campaign, the same unit of Russian intelligence that was responsible for the hacking of the Democratic Party emails. And Manafort was sharing with Russian intelligence their polling data, internal campaign polling data, and their strategy for battleground states. So the Trump campaign is sharing information useful to the Russian social media campaign to elect Donald Trump. Most Americans would call that collusion. But what I think Donald Trump did very effectively with his mantra of no collusion, no obstruction, is that he was so relentlessly on message that he persuaded a lot of the country that there was no collusion or no obstruction when there was both. And that is a sort of a triumph of propaganda over evidence.
You repeat something enough.
Exactly.
So staying on Russia, in the run-up to Putin's second invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there was an unprecedented declassification and release of U.S. intelligence product to Ukraine, to U.S. allies, and to the public. Do you see that as being appropriate, and do you think it was effective, and does it now become a new norm?
I think it was very effective, very appropriate, and indeed in the run-up to the release of that information, I, among others, had been urging the administration to do that, to go public with the information we were seeing. In the run-up to the war, we were witnessing things in the skiff, we were witnessing things through our intelligence that became inconsistent with it being a drill. Now, you might remember prior to the actual invasion of Ukraine, there was a massive Russian buildup, and then a Russian drawdown. And there was some speculation when the Russians began building up forces again on the border of Ukraine that maybe they'll draw them down again. And indeed, when the administration did go public, and in an effort to both persuade and prepare Ukraine and the allies for what was coming, some of our allies didn't believe us. Indeed, President Zelensky expressed his own skepticism about our intelligence and what the Russian plans were. And I think the importance of that public disclosure was not that the administration or that those of us on the committee thought that as a result of disclosing what the Russians intended, that it would stop Putin's invasion. If Putin was determined to invade, he was going to invade. But what it did do is when our intelligence proved to be so accurate, when we disclosed what was going to happen, and it did, it stripped away any pretext the Russians had hoped to offer. And so as a result, I think it enabled the administration to much more rapidly and successfully coalesce the allies around some very punishing sanctions than would have otherwise been the case. So I think it proved to be enormously important. when that, in the aftermath of that, as we began watching China and China's reaction to the war and what China might be willing to do, I also urge the administration to be public about anything we might see with respect to China, so that China would understand that if it got involved in helping Russia make war on Ukraine, that China would have blood on its hands. It might get involved, it might support Russia, but it would not be able to do so clandestinely. We would expose Chinese actions. So will it become the new norm? I'm not sure. In order to depart from the usual precedent of not disclosing intelligence, I think we were greatly benefited by having a director of the CIA in Bill Burns, who came out of the State Department, who was not a career intelligence officer, who understood, I think, the importance of information, the information warfare space. And the natural inclination, of course, of the agencies, as you know, is not to disclose anything. And whether we end up in the future defaulting back to that starting point, I think is unclear. It will probably very much depend on the president, the future presidents, as well as their intelligence heads, and the circumstances. You know, finally, when you decide to make disclosures of intelligence, what you try to do is identify the things that you can share publicly that could have many sources, so that your adversary cannot kind of reverse engineer and figure out how you know what you know, because there would be multiple sources. So for example, if commercial satellite imagery shows things that clandestine imagery also shows, you disclose and you discuss what's available in the commercial imagery. And so I would expect those kind of analyses will continue in the future.
Well, you preempted my question on if it concerns you about sources and methods, if you think that these one-time releases then degrade our ability to collect down the road.
You know, they certainly could, depending on the nature of the disclosure that you make. I'm confident that in the case of the run-up to the war, that the administration made the right calculus about what it could disclose without compromising sensitive sources. And what they did seems to be more than justified by the events that followed. You know, I will say also, one of the questions I kept asking in the run-up to the war, which I've continued asking since then, is how is this supposed to end? And it's a real revealing question to ask, because it reveals the limits of intelligence. Members of the Intelligence Committee, particularly newer members of the committee, often ask the intelligence agency representatives policy questions. And the agency representatives are very careful to say, we're not policymakers, you're the policymakers. What we can tell you is that if we do X, there is a significant chance or a decent chance or no chance that our adversary might do Y, or this is how this would be interpreted, or this is what our intelligence tells us the result could be. But whether you should do that, whether the trade-offs are worthwhile, is not a question for us as intelligence agency people. It's a question for policymakers. But in asking a question, how is this supposed to end, that's not a policy question, but it does reveal the limits of what the agencies can actually see. They don't have a crystal ball, although sometimes we feel like they might. And part of what has made that question so difficult to answer is that the war was predicated on a lot of misconceptions by Putin in particular. Putin miscalculated the Ukrainian will to fight. He miscalculated Zelensky's leadership ability. He miscalculated his own military's capacity to fight. He miscalculated, I think, the degree to which we could unite Europe and other allies and keep them together. So there have been an endless string of miscalculations on Putin's part. There is one calculation, though, that he made, which has yet to be proven right or wrong. And this ultimately may be the most important calculation of all. And that is his calculation that Ukraine matters more to him and to Russia than it does to the US and the West. we need to make sure that he's wrong in that calculation too, which means that we need to maintain strong bipartisan support for Ukraine. The stakes are enormously high for the Ukrainian people, for their democracy, but also for the whole international rules-based order, and more concretely, what would a Russian victory mean to China's ambitions in Taiwan or Turkey's ambitions in Armenia or Azerbaijan's? It could unleash a whole set of adverse consequences should Russia establish a precedent that we can once again remake the map of Europe or anywhere else using military force.
Thank you. It does seem that Putin's strategy is to try to wear down the West, wear down political will, wear down economic support, U.S., Europe, NATO, its allies. How do you sustain that support through this? How do you keep that bipartisan consensus?
Yeah. Well, it's difficult. I'm pleased with how we have done so far. It's difficult to keep Europe together. It's difficult to keep Congress together. What has made it even more difficult to keep Congress together is that, and I know this seems like an oxymoron, but the intellectual thought leader of today's GOP is Tucker Carlson. He, more than anyone else, influences Republican thought because he has the largest audience in the Republican base. And on his program, he does nothing but peddle Kremlin talking points. Indeed, the last time I went on his show, which was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, even then he was pushing Kremlin talking points. And I said, you know, you ought to move your show to RT, Russia Today, which he didn't appreciate. But ironically, today they rebroadcast portions of his program on RT because the Russians could not improve upon his own propaganda. And I remember about 3 months into the Ukraine war, speaking with someone who had been on a board with Rupert Murdoch, and asking him, he was not on the Fox board, but he was on a different board, Rupert Murdoch. And I said, you know this guy, can you explain something to me? American companies are pulling out of Russia to their credit. It's hurting their bottom line, but they're doing the right thing. And yet on Fox, Rupert Murdoch is allowing his most valuable real estate, his primetime hour, to be used to push Kremlin talking points. That Ukraine's not a real country, and Ukraine brought this on themselves, and we should be with the Russians, they've got the oil. How could Murdoch do that? Does he not care about anything? Does he not care about this country or Ukraine or democracy or anything? Could it really be just about the money? And he said, yes, I know him, and yes, I served on a board with him, and it's just about the money. But even so, I didn't want to believe it. But in this Fox litigation, now that we can see the emails and the text messages, and you can see it's just about the money. But that may be the motivation at Fox, but the effect, I think, is so destructive. And we're going to have to work hard, and we are, to continue to maintain the support we have in Congress, because the consequences of a failure to do so would just be awful.
Switching to the other topic that has bipartisan consensus, China. Seems to be that you'd be shouted out of town to say a good word about China now in Washington, or just about anywhere else in the country. Massive shift in public opinion and political opinion. Are you worried that this is leading us down a pathway to dangerous confrontation because of the lack of nuance in the debate?
I think that what we're seeing is a result of a pretty dramatic shift with China. That is, China had, for, I would say decades, but centuries, or even millennia might be more accurate, but very inward-looking. China is no longer very inward-looking. It now feels that it has every right to be a major player on the world stage, to challenge the supremacy of the United States. It is a forceful competitor an adversary in almost every domain, economic, in cyberspace, in real space, on sea, in development assistance. It is a potent rival. Economically, the Belt and Road Initiative, the ability to buy friends and influence people around the world presents a profound challenge to the United States. So some conflict and tension was going to be inevitable. Now, it doesn't have to become a hot conflict, and we ought to be doing what we can to prevent it from being a hot conflict. The most likely provocation of a hot conflict between the US and China is Taiwan, which again gets back to why Ukraine is so important. China is watching Ukraine largely through the prism of what does it mean for their ambition in Taiwan. And China has to be deeply concerned about a few things. It has to be deeply concerned about the ability of a smaller, much weaker, ostensibly weaker power to hold off a much stronger, larger power. China also has to be concerned about the degree to which the United States has been able to marshal international support to aid Ukraine in that fight. At the same time, China understands that were we to impose the kind of economic sanctions on China that we have on Russia, the economic impact of the United States would be far greater. But nonetheless, the strongest deterrent to China's ambition in Taiwan, and therefore to a flashpoint between the US and China, is supporting Ukraine, but also supporting Taiwan, helping Taiwan harden its defenses. So that China understands that it would be economically as well as militarily perilous to invade Taiwan. But it is, I think, certainly a tense relationship, becoming more tense every day. We have to try to manage that relationship in a way that it doesn't become a hot conflict. I think it can be managed that way. And it'll be interesting to see whether this potential trip of the Commerce Secretary goes forward and what the results of that is.
Does the erosion of strategic ambiguity help or hurt in that regard? Does it help deterrence or erode it?
I think that it probably helps deterrence by being less ambiguous, but it also potentially raises a risk of conflict. It's really, I think, very difficult to divine exactly where that line is. But I think that to the degree that we can assist Taiwan in strengthening its defenses, that may be among the most important ways of deterring a military intervention by China.
Okay. You mentioned open source intelligence and its usefulness, utility in being able to provide masking or cover to release other intelligence more exquisitely collected. As you look at the capabilities of open source intelligence, do you think the U.S. intelligence community is making good enough use of it? Is it done in a coordinated fashion? Is there enough money going towards it? And does it need to be a different organizational structure to take advantage of a new world of information?
This is a question that we have grappled with on the committee, and indeed we charge the intelligence community with analyzing whether the current structure is sufficient to make use of open source of intelligence. And by open sources, what we're talking about is so much of the intelligence that we need. We now don't need to have a spy to collect. We don't need to have a satellite to collect. We don't need to have a tap to collect a wiretap. It's just all out in the open. You just need to know where to look for it. When Russians are using social media, posting where they are in Ukraine, you don't need any special tool to identify, where certain units of the Russian military may be. So there's a lot of information. Now there's a lot of information about Americans too. And so this cuts in a variety of directions. One of the particular challenges that we face with China is China has so successfully hacked so many American databases. It now has access to an extraordinary amount of information about Americans. And when you use AI to combine the data that it has acquired and stolen, along with ubiquitous camera surveillance within China, the degree to which China is also exporting, and I can't remember the Orwellian sounding name they have for this, safe cities, I think is what they call it. They export the safe cities technologies to other nations, basically, so they can have ubiquitous surveillance too. Now, China may also have access to that ubiquitous surveillance it's exporting to other countries. So it has a huge capacity, which, by deploying artificial intelligence, can be quite a challenge, both in terms of counterintelligence risks at home, but also our own intelligence gathering efforts around the world. And so these are profound challenges. I do think that there is still so much more that we can divine from open source. And one of the tools will be AI in our ability to do it. Now, the AI that you all have been hearing about lately is one kind of AI, the ChatGPT version. But in the Intel world, when we think of AI, we think more of, okay, let's say we have a satellite watching something happening in Iran. And we have signals intelligence listening to something else completely unrelated or apparently unrelated. AI might be able to make a connection between the images the satellite is seeing and what is being collected before a human being could. It's called tipping and queuing. And so using those kind of abilities, technologies, machine learning, we can better protect the country. But of course, our adversaries can do the same thing. But I do think that there's still so much more that we can do to make use of open source. And I do question, because the organizational structure we have now was not established with an eye towards where we are today. It has sort of evolved to the current structure, whether it is sufficient to fully tap that resource.
Thank you. I'll have one more question, and then we'll go to the audience. There's microphones to the left and to the right and up in the loges, so line up, and we'll get to you. But my last question is, so in the face of ubiquitous tactical surveillance, in the face of biometrics, in the face of increasingly authoritarian regions that are denied or very difficult to operate, in the face of leaks and compromises of intelligence, is human intelligence, classical spying, classical espionage, dead, overtaken by events, a vestigial organ of espionage in the IC?
No, it isn't. There will always be a role for human intelligence. That role will continue to change and evolve, and it will differ, as it always has, from country to country. It certainly has made certain operating environments much more difficult. And that means that the tradecraft, in order to avoid detection, has to be that much better. So it's kind of a cat and mouse game. The greater the ability to detect, then the greater has to be the tradecraft to avoid detection. But there's always going to be a role. There are always going to be sources of information that you can't get any other way than through human beings. But the profession today, for somebody that began 25 years ago and someone starting today, looks completely different. But still, I will say this for any of you that might be considering a career in the agencies. They do incredible work. They're remarkable professionals. They have done amazing things to keep the country safe. And probably, as Sherry can tell you as well, probably the most inspiring, interesting work that we get to do as members of Congress is visit our service members, visit our diplomats, and visit our intelligence community professionals around the world. And the IC people are often operating with no safety net. When we're with the military, the military have a tough job, a dangerous job. They're often, though, in large bases with a lot of security, when our IC people are often on their own and with very little margin for error. And I have great respect for all of our folks serving overseas, But the IC people don't get many shout outs because we can't say who they are. But they're incredibly brave, patriotic people.
Well, thanks for the shout out for people that are serving in the shadows in dark places. Let's start back here. First question.
Hi, I'm Maya. I'm from Palo Alto, California, and I wanted to ask about your Senate campaign. So obviously the US Senate is a national body, but you would be running to represent California, and I wanted to ask you what you think are the most important political issues for California right now and what your vision for the state is.
You know, I think there are three existential challenges that we face. One is to our democracy. I think those of us, everyone in this room who grew up in the post-World War II period believe that increasing freedom and democracy and representative government was a law of nature. We were constantly seeing new democracies being born. Our freedoms were increasing. Our ability to worship as we like, associate with whom we would, love whom we would, all of this was increasing with a certain inevitability. We've discovered over the last several years there's nothing inevitable about democracy. And indeed, over the last several years, we've seen a decline in democracy at home, and we've seen a decline in democracy around the world. I never would imagine seeing half the things that we saw over the last several years. The attacks on our judiciary, the undermining of our institutions, the attacks on co-equal branches of government by the administration against the legislative branch. And we're not out of the woods. If you look at the reaction to Donald Trump's indictment in New York, Ron DeSantis, within 24 hours, issued a statement that both was dishonest about what was happening in New York, promised he wouldn't extradite the president, essentially undermining the rule of law, and just for good measure added in two references to George Soros, so that it would have a nice bit of anti-Semitism besides. This is where competition is in the Trumpist party right now. And as long as one of America's two great political parties is no longer a party of conservative ideology, but a kind of a cult around the former president, our democracy is going to be vulnerable. So this is one of the existential challenges, and I'd like to bring the leadership I've shown in the House to the Senate to represent California, but also to defend our democracy nationwide. The second existential issue is the economy, and these two issues, I believe, are deeply intertwined. The economy for years has simply not been working for millions of people. Millions who can't afford a place to live, who can't access quality health care, millions who feel their quality of life has slipped below that of their parents, and look at their children's future and see it in doubt, and has left people vulnerable to a demagogue who comes along and promises that he alone can fix it. And so to me, the challenges facing our economy are intertwined with the challenges facing our democracy. During the pandemic, when we more than doubled the child tax credit, we lifted 40% of the kids living in poverty out of poverty. That ought to tell us something. It ought to tell us that, number one, this isn't rocket science, but it should also tell us that this is a policy choice that we're making. The fact that the economy has developed in such a way where people who are struggling more, and people who are doing well are doing even better, and the middle seems to be falling out, is the result of policy choices that we're making, and they're terrible choices. So fighting for an economy that works for everyone is also a core part of what I want to do for California. And finally, the planet. This is the existential issue of them all. If we don't get this right, then the others are going to be pretty moot after a period of time. I'm really proud of what we did in the Inflation Reduction Act. It was the most massive development in attacking climate change in our history, but we have to view that as just the beginning. And I think the good news on climate, and it's important, I think, for us to know there is good news on climate, and that is that there is science and technology that can help us get ahead of the tipping point. If we stop incentivizing the wrong things like the fossil fuel industry, and we start seriously incentivizing renewable energy, and we wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, we can save the planet. And these to me, are the existential issues. This is what I'm campaigning on in California, what I think my constituents in the state really care about. Who's going to bring down the cost of things? Who's going to help people find affordable housing? Who's going to deal with the homelessness crisis, which is the result of decades now of policy in which we have allowed those doing well to do better and those doing poorly to fall into homelessness. And I think what the voters of California are looking for is who can work together with people of varying viewpoints to actually solve these problems. And that's what I'm offering.
Thanks, you teed it up nicely. Up here.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm Metin Agverdi from Germany. I'm a member of the German Bundestag, the federal parliament, and I'm here as a fellow at the Center for European Studies. So thank you very much. It's an honor to be here in this institution, and thank you for you being here. I'm studying here, or I'm trying to get around what the China-U.S. relationship, how that will develop. And you already talked about this. And my question is very simple. Does Europe play any role in the Indo-Pacific from the American point of view? Are we having a role in this? You've probably heard about Mr. Macron's trip just a few days ago. So, but not particularly on this part, but generally speaking, in the long run, what could be our position? Are we of any help, or is that just far away from us and it's more an American business? And by the way, just from a German lawmaker perspective, the intelligence sharing policy of the United States at the beginning of last year was probably one of the most important decisions the government of the US and you guys basically made, not only, as you said, for sharing the intelligence, but also for the storytelling afterwards to keep NATO, to keep the Western world together. It was a very important decision, so thank you for that one. But I'm interested if you can give me any advice on the China issue. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I think Europe will play an enormously important role in a number of respects. Vis-a-vis the point I was making about China's view of Ukraine with an eye towards Taiwan, you will probably have a better sense than I do of how we're doing in keeping Europe together around sanctions over Russia. And I think the degree to which that the United States and Europe remain united in our support of Ukraine is going to be essential to the success of the Ukrainian war effort. And likewise, there are innumerable areas where we have a common defense interest in being able to push back against Chinese violations of international law, even though it may not be within European waters. Our solidarity on things that China's doing in the South China Sea, for example, I think is still extraordinarily important. Our unity on economic issues to try to level the playing field when it comes to trade with China. Using our collective economic strength, the United States and Europe, there's really no end to the degree to which we could force China to open up its markets and require a more level playing field when it comes to commerce. So I think both economically and in terms of our national defense, there are key issues. In terms of whether Europe can play the kind of role Macron would like to play, kind of a shuttle diplomacy, I guess I'm skeptical. I think ultimately what China's most interested in is what is the United States going to do and have to say about this, and vice versa. So I'm not sure there is a Kissinger-like role here. But I think in terms of our solidarity on economic and defense issues, that's going to be important, critical, in fact.
Thank you. Let's go up here, then down to here. We've got 10 minutes, so let's keep questions short.
Hi, thank you very much for coming, Congressman. I'm a sophomore in the college, and I was hoping for your perspective as former intelligence chair on the very recent leak of U.S. military documents regarding the war in Ukraine. What, in your view, is their significance, and how, if at all, should it impact Americans' assessments of ongoing events in Ukraine?
Yeah. Here I have an advantage of not being the chair. And because one of the things you have to do when you're on the committee or chair of the committee is you have to constantly compartmentalize and think about what am I allowed to say, what am I not allowed to say. Here, since I have not been briefed on it, I've got a pretty good license to go on the basis of, if the published reports are true. And if the published reports are true that these are, in fact, top secret documents on the subjects they purport to be, it's a very, very serious breach. If they're discussing insights about the Ukrainian war efforts and vulnerability, there were reports today that there are documents that discuss how soon air defense munitions will run out. Those are really painful disclosures if they're accurate. Now, there are also public reports that the number of Russian casualties appear to have been manipulated, which is a very interesting thing if true, because it either means the document is a forgery or it means the document is real but it has been altered. And why would it be altered? That gives you kind of a clue of who's doing the altering if it's going to minimize Russian casualties in Ukraine. Now, the big question right now for the intel agencies and the FBI is, what's the source of the leak? Because until you identify the source of the leak, you cannot assume that the leaks are over. And so every effort has to be made ASAP to figure out, where do these come from? What can we tell from the images that are public of these documents? And how do we close the leak? There are also reports, public reports of documents involving insights on our allies like South Korea. Obviously, those are very sensitive, and the public reports indicate that the opposition party in South Korea is making hay over either the South Korean government's vulnerability to spying or the US spying on South Korea. So obviously all of this, if accurate, is harmful to our national security, to our alliances. But I think having been through a number of these now, the United States and our allies recognize our profound mutual interest, which is profound enough to overcome the friction that will be caused by these disclosures. But nonetheless, some of them could be extremely damaging, and of course, we don't know whether the ones that have been made public or been accessed are the whole inventory or just a portion of it. This gets to a slightly different point than the one you were making about open source information. And that is, there's two phenomena that are sort of relatively new in the history of espionage. One is people leaking just to leak. In the past, you had people stealing data and selling data. I prosecuted a Russian spy when I was an assistant US attorney in a sex for secrets case. There used to be a lot of sex for secrets cases. I don't know what it means about the changes in society, but not so many sex for secrets cases anymore. It's people stealing stuff and just publishing it, or it's hacking. And so you can conduct espionage from a cubicle somewhere in Beijing if you're a good enough hacker, and you don't have to risk coming to this country or penetrating an agency, et cetera. And so plugging those leaks we see, because there have been multiple of them now, is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do.
Yeah. I'll make a bold prediction that this was opportunistic, that it's relatively limited, and it's far better to have a few hundred documents leaked by someone who's leaking, a gamer channel, than an embedded intelligence agent, a Russian spy, a Chinese spy, in secret, providing thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of documents. Back here.
Hi, Congressman. My name's Matt. I'm a 1L at Harvard Law. And in Chief Counsel of the January 6th Committee's study group, she's actually in the audience, I think over there. We've been talking about successful oversight of the January 6th committee when it comes to subpoena compliance. But there's also been a lot of oversight that's been ignored on the January 6th committee and previously after the Democrats took back the House in the 2018 midterm. So my question to you was about inherent contempt and whether it's time to bring back the legislative branch's authority to haul these people, into Congress or fine them, like I know you discussed, after so much oversight has been ignored. Is it time to rethink this, or is the status quo adequate?
Well, the status quo is certainly not adequate. And just by way of explanation, in the Ukraine investigation, you'll remember the Trump administration took the position of stonewalling all subpoenas. And in the January 6th investigation, we had any number of witnesses simply refuse to come in or refuse to answer questions or invoke meritless claims of privilege. And the most we were able to do is either sue to get enforcement, which is slow and cumbersome and never timely enough to accomplish the object, or to refer them for criminal contempt. We referred 4 people for criminal contempt. The Justice Department, even though the statute says they shall present it before the grand jury, decided that shall doesn't really mean shall. Shall actually means may, might, if we feel like it. What day is today? And so we bat only 50%. Now, if witnesses know they only have a 50% chance of being held accountable, that's not all that compelling. Inherent contempt is something that Congress hasn't done in decades, but it involves Congress's inherent ability to literally find someone in contempt of Congress and clap them in irons, throw them into the jail. There used to be a jail in the Capitol. Now there's no longer a jail in the Capitol. And while I think and have advocated that we investigate resurrecting the power of inherent contempt, it also seems to me it is not a cure-all. Because, well, let's play this out. Let's say we reopened the jail in the Capitol. And we subpoenaed someone, they refused to show up. We issued a warrant for the House Sergeant to arrest them. And they did arrest them. There would be a habeas corpus petition filed. They would, I think, undoubtedly not be incarcerated while that habeas corpus petition was litigated. It would still need to go up and down the courts. And for a session that at its longest is 2 years, you still may not get a resolution in 2 years. So I think probably the more powerful remedy, and this is something I authored a bill in conjunction with my fellow chairs called the Protecting Our Democracy Act that has a whole set of what I call our own post-Watergate reforms. And among the most important is the expedition of congressional subpoenas, where we could go straight to a 3-judge court and appeal to the Supreme Court with an expedited schedule in order to enforce our subpoenas. And to me, that would be more efficacious than resurrecting inherent contempt. But in the, let me just mention, in the first impeachment, there were 2 articles. One article dealt with the withholding of these hundreds of millions of dollars to coerce Zelensky. The other article, which got a lot less attention because it was a lot less sexy than the first, was the obstruction of Congress. And one of the arguments I made during that impeachment trial was, in some respects, the second article was far more important than the first. Because if we don't hold the president accountable, for obstructing Congress, it fundamentally alters the balance of power in Congress in perpetuity. And if Congress can't do its oversight, there'll never be an Article 1. There'll never be a substantive charge if you can't, in fact, do your oversight. And so I think of all of the reforms, and there are many in the Protecting Our Democracy Act, the expedition, the enforcement of congressional subpoenas is among the most important.
That brings us full circle. We're at the top of the hour. Our time's up. Been a fascinating discussion. I've got about 50 more questions.
Can I say one thing before we conclude? Sure. First of all, the country is going through a very difficult time. But I just want to emphasize that we're going to get through this. And we need all of you to be engaged. I have great optimism and hope about the future for a number of reasons. One is some of the very best people I've ever met over the last several years have decided to step up and run for office. In the same way that people after 9/11 joined the service to defend our country, others have decided, given the danger facing our democracy, to run for office. They come out of the State Department and the military and the intelligence community. They're educators and doctors, they're community leaders, and they're incredible. And I look at these new members and I say to myself, you know, the future looks really bright. But the other thing that makes me optimistic about the future is that young people are impatient in all the best ways. You have no patience for bigotry, no patience for what we're doing to the planet. After growing up and going to active shooter drills in your schools, you have no patience for this scourge of gun violence. The country's going to be in your hands soon. The country could be in your hands right now if you voted in your numbers. You know who votes? Old people vote. Old people vote. You want to run the country, you need to start voting. Now, people obviously in this room are voting, but you need to get your colleagues to be engaged. We don't have the luxury of despair. We don't have the luxury of inaction. Like every other generation, we're going to have to struggle for our country, for our future, for our very democracy. But this too shall pass. And what we do in this moment will determine how quickly it passes. So I want to encourage you. And more than that, I want to enjoin you to be involved. The country desperately needs you. Thank you very much.
Congressman.
Pleasure being with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.